Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Rabbi Ben and Rebbetzin Shani Skydel, Lezecher Nishmas Norman Skydel, Nehemia Baruch Ben Aaron Shapsi, and Barbara Skydel Safran Bina Bas Aaron Shapsi. Their neshamos should have an aliyah. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast in any way, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the links and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and so on. And you can also find the link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, which is more of the same, just in a different medium. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, or elsewhere. And if you do listen on Apple, if you can rate and write a review if you haven't done so yet. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Stephen Fine, who is the YU Distinguished Professor and the Horgan Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, and who is also the director of the YU Center for Israel Studies and the Israelite Samaritans Project. And this episode will be discussing the Samaritans. And Professor Fine edited a volume titled The Samaritans, A Biblical People, as well as a documentary and other things. So thank you, Professor Fine, for joining me once again.
I'm so happy to be with you. It's so much fun.
So how did you come to be interested in the Samaritans?
You know, I had a teacher at the Hebrew University in the 60s named Dov Noy, who was the father of the study of Jewish folklore. And he had an open house every Monday night. And you wouldn't believe the people who came to it. Anybody from Hasidim to Ethiopians to Christians. And they'd all sit around the living room and talk about what they found interesting. And I, being the undergraduate, was sort of the Hermione Granger, right? I would show up every week, and I would meet all these people that I never in my life even knew existed, right? From all different ways of living and seeing and being. And one week, one of the Samaritans walked in. His name's Benny Tzedakah. We've been friends ever since. And so I was cognizant of their existence. But when I was finishing my PhD in the late 80s, there was a huge renaissance of Samaritan studies. There was scholarship being written, but more importantly, there were important archaeological discoveries all over Israel that were coming out at exactly that moment. And when read together with the books that were being published in Hebrew and in English for the first time, and not in Samaritan script, I had a wealth of things to look at, and I realized that there's another group out there in the world of Chazal. You know, there's those pagans, and then there's the Christians, and then there's that other Israelite group, right? The Sabbath keeping, sort of kashrut keeping, holiday keeping, people who call themselves Shomrei HaTorah. And it was sort of like going into the Twilight Zone, because you meet the Samaritans and they look like us and they feel like us, and you walk into the uncanny valley, they ain't us. And that was the fascinating thing about it, that this is the next group over, and we have contact with them that only goes back 2,500 years. That's an astonishing thing, right? And for scholarship, universities, you've probably noticed lately, tend to live in silos. Everybody does his own thing. So there were the Samaritan people doing their stuff over here, and the Jewish studies people over here, and the Christians over there, and they were hardly talking to each other, except that the Jews and the Christians were talking, because the Christians were the Balabai, right, in the universities. So the Jews and the Christians were talking, but the Samaritanologists were sort of lonely off by themselves, and very nice people doing interesting things. And here I had people from the time of the Chachamim, from the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud, in Eretz Yisrael, who in some cities were the majority population, like in Caesarea. If you went to Caesarea in the 3rd or 4th century, there were 3 populations, the Jews, Samaritans, and pagans. And the Samaritans were the largest group. And here we are living with these people. After the Chorban, there were warm relationships. In the 4th century, those began to, they cooled and they warmed throughout the last 2,000 years. So it's really a cool set of relationships. And the people who study it are few in number, though I'm happy to say there are more since I started this project.
Let's talk about them. The Samaritans in English, in Hebrew. Kuti, what are they in Hebrew?
Well, I'll tell you. In the Midrashim, they're the Shumra, which is Samaritans, right? And that's what Chazal call them, the Shumra. Kuti is, well, let me give you a story. When my oldest son, who's now 35, was a little first or second grader at the Cincinnati Hebrew Day School, he was doing what everybody else is doing in the fall. They were doing Masechet Rosh Hashanah, right? And so the teacher comes to these people called the Kusim, these awful Kusi people who mess up the messaging off to Babylonia, and these awful Kusim, right? And my son raised his hand and said, Rabbi so-and-so, you should not call Samaritans Kutim. And he looked at him and said, why, Alicia? And my little boy looked at him and said, because it's like the N-word. You should not say that. They don't like it. How do you know that, Alicia? Well, my dad has friends who are Samaritans. So I go to pick up my kid from school. And anybody who's been in Cincinnati knows it's a small community. You walk to pick up your kid, and we did. And the rabbi was standing outside in the carpool, and he looked at me and said, you know Kutim? Or Kusim, I guess he said, right? I said, yeah, of course. And then I ended up giving him all these things to read. People are always surprised that they're out there. And part of the problem is that, you learn the Gemara, and you know that the Gemara that we use, somebody went through it with a marking pen and said that this can stay and this has to leave, right? The censors. Usually they were Jewish people working for the Christians, which is better than having the Christians do it. And so in order to avoid the censors, they would change words. So every so often, Notzrim, Christians, or Goyim, or Nochrim, right? All these words for non-Jews would get marked off, and you put something else there that wouldn't upset the Christians, right? So sometimes they put Saduki. Sometimes they'll put Kuti. And they do that a lot, okay? So, like, I was going through Hilchot Tisha B'Av the other day because I'm working on some keynote. And I was reminded that the first thing it says there is, don't go to the courts of the Kutim, because this is a bad time for Jews to have legal proceedings with the Kutim. Now, you think there's a Kuti Beit Din in Pinsk, right? In other words, somebody wrote Kuti there, and it was just a stand-in. But if you get enough of these, and they're all over the place, every bad person happens to be a Kuti. That's part of it, right? And so whatever the various attitudes are within Chazal, and there's a range that I could go through, the bad ones are magnified by the censors and by our not recognizing what censorship looks like.
Absolutely. But when you go back to Chazal, I mean, you could parse it out and you see what's censored. You go back to Josephus. When they're referring to Kutim, they're referring to the Samaritans. Yeah.
Look, we all know the story that these people come in and they're bad converts and they do it because of lions and we don't like them, which, whatever you think of it, Judeans felt pretty good about that and calling other people names, right? In other words, once the story existed, it's pretty easy to call people names, to the point that Nablus in the early 20th century, late 19th century, where Jews and Samaritans lived together and usually got along, they still called them worshippers of doves, which is one of the taunts in the Gemara. In other words, or lion converts. In other words, that stuff came out over and over again. They don't see themselves that way. In other words, they see it as a taunt. And so calling their story of where they come from, you know what they think they come from, right? They come from the 10 tribes of Israel when those silly Judeans went south and chose a different spot. And the real spot is that, by the way, only mountain that's really mentioned all the way through the Torah by name, Mount Gerizim. The place where Noah's Ark landed, the place where Adam and Eve were in Gan Eden, the place where Akedat Yitzchak took place, the place where the Mishkan landed and is hidden in a cave down below and will come out when the Tahab, the returner, their kind of Messiah, comes back. And that's their story.
That's what their story is, and they believe they believe that they are descendants of the northern tribes.
Right. And there's no reason not to think they are. Every group is intermarried with other groups. That's not the question, right? That isn't the question. And there are good people and there are bad people in every group. That's also the case. And in different periods, we talk about our neighbors differently. All of those things are true, right? But we have an unbroken link of sources that go back to people like Sanballat, who we know from Ezra and Nehemiah. We also have it in letters from Egypt written by them to the governor in Shechem called Sanballat. And we have their temple, which goes back to the 5th century BCE. We have a lot of stuff that goes back to biblical times that traces right through. You may know that in December in Kislev, I forget what day, there's a holiday, not Hanukkah. It comes out in a book called Megillat Ta'anit, which is a list of days you're not supposed to fast. It's sort of a minor holiday like Yom Yerushalayim or Memorial Day or something, right? And so it's called Yom Har Gerizim. the day that the Hasmoneans destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim in 120-something BCE, which in antiquity was a holiday for Jews. So there's been this back and forth for a long time.
Now, you mentioned that split difference between the Samaritans and us, and when did that occur? And we're going to get into discussing like the size of their community, their beliefs, their writing. You mentioned before. We have to really explain what they are here. We're already talking for like 10 minutes, like what's going on? People are like, what's the story here? But what's with that split? When did that really take place?
Let me tell you how we say it and how they say it, and what I could say as a historian who reads both. The split happened, when the northern tribes broke from Jerusalem. That's the Jewish answer, right? Their answer is that the split happened when the southern tribes broke from Har Gerizim, when Eli was ridiculous enough to go to Shiloh, right? And the story goes on, and we tell alternate histories of each other in biblical times. Now, for me, looking back, I see this sort of two communities that have been related in so many ways throughout Jewish history. In the time of the Rambam in Egypt, the Samaritans, the Karaites, and the Jews were the same community. And this is how it worked for much of the history. There's a great story in the 16th century of this Sephardi rabbi named Tam ben Yechia, who got a question. We in the synagogue near Izmir have a Samaritan parochet. Clearly some Nundik walked in and didn't like what he saw, because it was this beautiful parochet with metal letters, and we have one just like it on Mount Gerizim or something very similar. And the question was, can we keep it? Okay? Clearly someone came and said, how can you keep that? Right? Otherwise these things don't get asked. So somebody went all the way to Istanbul to ask. So the letter he came back was, there's no reason you shouldn't keep it. And today, we know that they don't pray to doves. So, but just the same, don't keep it, right? It's a typical rabbinic answer, right? I don't have a good reason why you shouldn't, but it doesn't feel right. Don't put it in the shul. But when the conversation is that delicate on these sorts of subjects, you get a sense of what's going on, right? That it's far more interesting than black and white.
Yeah, we can get to some of the rabbinic attitudes throughout the centuries towards them. And by the way, Tam ben Yechia Shal Shuvas Tumas Yesharim, I believe is the name of his Shuvah Sefer. Now let's talk about them. The size of the community historically, the language they speak, the language they write, how they write, their famous their ksav, their real Ivri ksav. Let's talk about a lot of the different their beliefs. Let's tell the listeners a lot about them.
There are 850 Samaritans today. It may be 870, it may be 860, but approximately 850. They're split between two communities, half of them in Cholon, where they have a community, and the other on Mount Gerizim, where they've only recently developed a community. Until the first Intifada, they lived in Shechem, and then they moved on top of the mountain for safety purposes. Okay? 850 may sound like a little bit. It's about two 747s, I think. But the reality is that in 1900, they were less than 100 and a quarter. They were really dying out. The reason being that starting in the 1840s, our dear friends in Nablus were giving them help, up to the point that in the 18th century, they were simply wiped out in Damascus. So they had every reason to be very, very concerned. Okay? So there was a very small number of these people. They were under incredible pressure. And then the British discovered them and said, oh, look, Bible people, aren't they interesting? And then the Zionists discovered them and said, oh, look, Landsmen, isn't this interesting, right? Israelites who never left. This is perfect, right? So Yitzchak ben Zvi adopted them. In fact, one of the first laws made by the Knesset was including the Samaritans in the law of return. And a process of re-establishing relations began in the last third of the 19th century when the Chacham Bashti, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, was apparently contacted by the British ambassador who was protecting both Jews and Samaritans, the consul general, and asked to write a letter to the Turks that said, and it said, the Samaritans are Israelites who believe in the Torah of Moses, which kept them from being killed. You can imagine after the Jews protected them from being killed, the relationship warmed really quickly. And so as the late 19th century developed, and as Jews developed an interest in them, and as the British developed an interest in them, and so, for example, the Queen Victoria's son, when he came on a trip to the Near East, stopped there for the Korban Pesach on the way, as this same consul was running the show. There was a movement to rehabilitate the relationship, really from both sides. And that was part of the interesting thing about it, because it was to no one's advantage to be angry at each other. And it was to everyone's advantage to be the two Israelite groups, and especially for 125 dying Samaritans. And the way that their numbers rose was that one of them, who lived in Yafo, married a Jewish woman who had a son, who she was an almanah. She couldn't get married, and he was handsome. So somebody made a shidduch. Ben Zvi made a shidduch. They got married, and that happened a few times. But a few times is enough for a community like this to increase its numbers until the 90s or so, when less and less Jews were willing to marry them, and nobody's going to go to Shechem. And they were in such a crisis that the high priest finally allowed conversion. Up until then, they didn't have a sense of conversion. If a Jew wanted to be a Samaritan, it was part of the family, right? But it never let a Gentile in, a woman from Ukraine, which is what they brought. And so they have a whole contingent of women from Ukraine who have then built their population, which is why there are 850 living in very nice houses on Mount Gerizim and in very nice houses in Cholon, who do everything from, one of them was number 2 at Israel Government Coins and Metals. Another friend I have is a clerk at Budget Rent-A-Car at the airport. You might meet him when you go to Israel, and everything in between. And most importantly now, this is the advertisement, Har Bracha Techina, which is the best in Israel. And in a most hilarious way, created by the son of the high priest, under the hashgacha of the Badatz.
Yeah, we have Har Bracha Tchina, and it's funny, a neighbor told me at one point, he goes, when you make hummus, make sure you buy the Har Bracha Tchina, that's the best one. So that's it, that's Samaritan, look at that. And it has Badatz Hecher.
So it's a fascinating thing. They've really made it. They have people who are sort of emissaries. They have their own newspaper. They have scholars within the community who reach out to the bigger world, and their kids go to school and go in the army like everybody else.
Now, the size of the community, what about going back centuries? How big was the community? And also, at what point was the biggest? Do we know what the largest size of the community was?
Numbers in ancient history are very fudgeable.
Yes.
Right? Isn't it funny that they always like to say that there were 6 million Jews in the world of the Romans, which is sort of that round Jewish number, I'm sorry to say. And that number applied to the Roman Empire came from, where. And so numbers don't really tell us very much. I can tell you their span. And so we have archaeological material going all the way across the Mediterranean as far as Sicily, of Samaritan communities. We have literary sources that describe those Samaritan communities all the way across the Mediterranean world, from the 2nd century BC all the way through the 6th. In the Middle Ages, we have communities in Egypt, Damascus, all over the Near East. They were the smallest of the 3 groups in the world of the Rambam in Fustat. They were never huge. But after the Khorban, Second Temple's destruction, their communities were increased and spread into the area of Lod and even south of Lod. And their numbers in the coastal plain opposite Shomron, meaning Caesarea, were rather large. Now, we have lots of archaeological evidence for Samaritan communities in Eretz Yisrael in Talmudic period, going from Tel Castile, which is which is the Eretz Yisrael Museum in Ramat Aviv, going as far up through Herzliya, continuing to Caesarea, along the coast to the Carmel, and then inland. There's a huge amount. There's even, by the way, anybody whose children go to Yeshivat Shalavim, go into the fields and you will see the Samaritan synagogue. I always say that's the only yeshiva with its own Samaritan synagogue.
So that's just some on the sizing of this community. As you mentioned, today is about 850. Now, what about the language? Yeah. The language that they speak and the written language as well.
If you live in Shechem, you'll speak Arabic primarily. Though after the 6-Day War, the leadership went to Ulpan. Most of the men went to Ulpan. And so everybody speaks Hebrew. Many on Har Gerizim also say work in Ariel and use the Kupat Cholim at Har Bracha, which is a new thing. There used to be an enmity between all of these communities. There aren't anymore. Some of the Samaritan kids have been known to go to Gan in Har Bracha, which is a really interesting thing. They are, where's it going? So they, ask the question again. I lost it.
The language?
Languages. They speak Arabic or Hebrew. Now, when they're doing religion stuff, they'll either do Hebrew in, we would call Ketav Ra'at or Da'at, right? Ketav Ivri, the early biblical literature, or as they like to call it, Proto-Hebrew, right? as opposed to the Aramaic script that we use. In the Second Temple times, both communities used both. Samaritans have lit on their script as a distinctive marker of who they are. Jews have lit on their script as a distinctive marker of what Jews are not. And so Jews don't use it and Samaritans do. Right? If you look at something written by a contemporary Samaritan in Samaritan script, it's probably Israeli Hebrew written in Samaritan script because they have their own fonts. I have on my computer Bethel 1, which is the Samaritan script that I used all the way through my book, and they can read it. So you can go to the Beit Knesset there and get essentially Kabbalat Shabbat times written in Samaritan script. But people don't use it at home. Their holy books are written either in Hebrew, obviously like the Torah, or a Hebrew that's like Midrash Tanchuma, which is sort of a non-spoken Hebrew from the early Islamic period. Sometimes they'll write in Arabic. They wrote a lot in Arabic, much of it in Samaritan script, which is following the pattern, by the way, that we know from Jews as well, right? Saadia Gaon wrote in Arabic. Jews in Islamic lands often wrote in Arabic in Hebrew script. And so Samaritans did the same thing, right? And so their literature tracks with our literature on that front. Yeah. So those are the languages. What else?
Yeah, we know the Ramban, even there's the story and the quote in the Ramban's commentary. He gets there and he says he found this coin. He was an Arko and he says he couldn't read the coin. He showed it to the Samaritans. He says the Kutim. He said, because they know how to read this coin. They have this Ksav Ivri. They know how to read it.
And he knew it because before he got there, the Rambam had talked about it and Hai Gaon had talked about it. And everybody knew that the Samaritans had this script and they used it. Here's a cool story. There's a Samaritan story that was found in the Cairo Geniza. It was found, though, in Jewish square script. It means that Jews were reading the Samaritan story. And it was a great story. It was about Yehoshua ben Nun and essentially the return of the nations that were thrown out of Eretz Israel to attack him in Shechem. Okay? So it's this very Samaritan story. Who comes to save the day? It wasn't Mighty Mouse. It was the high priest, right? In other words, it's a very Samaritan story taking place on the plain of Shechem. So they found it in the Geniza, and it was there. But you know where else it's found? If you've ever read the book called Sefer Yuchasim, with the notes of a guy named Shmuel Sulam, when he edited the book, he took Zakuto's conclusion off the book, which is it's a history of Torah, essentially. It's a chronology. And it ended with some nasty comments about the Ottomans, which isn't a good idea to write when you live in Istanbul, right? So Sulam stuck something else that was exciting at the end. And he said as follows: this is a Jewish story that I found in a Samaritan book. Now, that Samaritan story found its way into that book. And from there, it was copied without that script on top all over Europe. And so the Samaritan Midrash found its way right into the center of our books. You can just watch it moving from place to place. It's just fascinating. So this interconnectedness.
Yes, you mentioned Sefer Yochsin, the 15th, 16th century history work, and now as well as the Ksav. So you're mentioning this Ksav. So if someone would see this Ksav today, anyone listening, most people listening to this podcast, would they be able to read this language or they would not be able to read it?
No. You can't. If you've looked at a 1 shekel coin, it says on it, Yehud in the ancient script. You can't read that. It's symbolic. On the first revolt coins, as you said, the script was used. So people have seen it. Jews have been finding these coins for a long time. Somebody brought one to Italy and showed it to a guy named Azaria Darasi. And Azaria Darasi went back and said, oh, look, the Ramban talked about this. And then he brought every other Rishon that ever talked about it. And then he made a letter chart and he said, isn't this cool, essentially? And that's the purpose of his article.
Azari Dirossi being the author of Ma'arei Naim, the first banned work, who there's a podcast on. Also, you mentioned the Cairo Geniza. For those not familiar, that's the repository of manuscripts and all sorts of different things that was found in the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo and now housed in mostly Cambridge, but all over the world, many different fragments and all different things. Okay, this is not the episode about the Geniza. Okay,
Can I add one more thing about the Cairo Geniza?
Yes,
the most important Jewish discovery of the 20th century. Far more important than other documents found in the Judean desert, because you'll find everything from the Rambam to Piyutim to just name it. You'll find it in the Cairo Geniza.
Everything. There's wedding invitations, birthday notes, math. There's everything in there. Cairo Geniza, we're still finding things, right? Researchers are finding things all the time. Now things are getting digitized. All the fragments, you can see it online. So
I was working on some fragments today and found something that I think is really cool. So yes,
the Geniza is fascinating. Okay, now let's Let's turn to their religious beliefs and the practices. You've mentioned the high priest. We're going to get to the high priest. But let's talk about what are their general beliefs and their general practices. Before we get to the Pesach, and you mentioned the Korban Pesach, well, let's talk about the general religious beliefs.
The last one, that's the least important.
Yeah, but later.
The Samaritans believe in one God. They believe that the Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. They believe that the holy mountain is Mount Gerizim. They believe in reward and punishment. They believe that at the end of the days, the tabernacle is going to come back to Mount Gerizim, and that a Moses-like figure called the Tahab, the returner, right, from the word Shav or Tav, is going to do it. Okay? Sometimes I, again, feel like I'm in the uncanny valley when I deal with them because it looks just like me, and then I say, oh, this is different.
Similar, but
so those are their basic beliefs. They have a halachic system everybody always wants to know. They're much more like Jews from Islamic countries, not surprisingly, than Europeans. They're much more, their literature is much more, this is how we do it, rather than this is how we think about it, the way, Ashkenazim do. They have a rich literature of Piyutim, some of which was just translated as part of our project by Laura Lieber, who's now in Germany. Really beautiful Piyutim, all from the world of Chazal. They have Midrashim, all from the world of Chazal. You can actually open up their Midrash and see Midrashim that you know from Chazal and say, hi, I didn't know you'd be here. So they have all this interesting material. They believe that doing the 613 mitzvot is imperative. Their ultimate religious leader is the high priest, who has the final say on everything. The high priest, up until the 17th century, believed that he was a descendant of Aaron, straight through Elazar. That family died out. And so they went to the next family over, the Kahatim. And so the high priest is from the Kahatim, which means he's really not the high priest from Aaron, but he's as close as they're going to get, right? They had to have continuity. They had to have a high priest, which again shows how their halachic system works. So the high priest has all the authority to make decisions, to deal with issues. Let me give you a good halachic example. Before 1967, there was a border. And they were allowed to cross the border, but only on Pesach time, to go and do what you mentioned before, the Korban Pesach, which is an essential mitzvah for them, to go to Har Gerizim and to do the Korban Pesach. And the way that by the way, they show that you're a member of the community is whether they let you eat the Korban or not. Okay? That's the marker, which should sound familiar. So there was a baby born, 2 babies, twins, in Cholon, in Tel Aviv at that point. And, being Samaritans, they're very strict. Children fast, babies fast. There's no dispensation for little kids not to fast on Yom Kippur. Everyone fasts, the animals fast. So Milah takes place on the 8th day, come hell or high water. They don't have a buyout, right? If a kid's sick or something. They just don't have it. It's not built into their system. Okay, so these little preemies are born, and they cannot be circumcised on the 8th day, if for no other reason than the Israeli doctors wouldn't dare allow it, right? So they sent an emissary across the border into Jordan to go to the high priest. Now, this particular high priest was a really cool guy. He used to write for Tel Aviv newspapers in the 90s. He was an Israeli spy. He was a really interesting guy, this high priest. So they asked him, what do we do? So the high priest looked at them and said, what's an incubator? And they explained to him an incubator is where you put a baby until it's prepared to come out on its own and breathe on its own, right? Great. So he said, it's an artificial rechem. It's an artificial womb. Yeah. So 8 days after the baby comes out of the incubator, that's when you're going to circumcise him. You hear the halachic thinking, right? And it's built into the community. This is, and we lived next door to Rav Yosef Kapach, Zichrono Livracha, a true tzaddik. And I watched how his community functioned. And I went to his Beit Knesset a number of times. And we lived in Naklaon, so I learned a lot of things. The Chacham is the leader, that the rabbi says is what happens. In many ways, the Kohen Gadol serves that function for this very small group, right? He takes all of the traditions and says, this is what we are. And because they don't have as deep a written tradition, they do have lots of books. Like they have books on Shechita and all that stuff, right? By the way, when they do Shechita, they do not say a bracha, and they point toward Mount Gerizim. Everybody wants to know. So no, don't eat their meat. But there's a fluidity that is we can recognize, but not among Ashkenazim. That's why I say it this way.
Yeah, you mentioned Yosef Kafich, the Temani staunch Maimonidean.
Yeah, except he called himself Kapach.
Yeah, he did. We know it's Kapach. Yeah, correct.
I wrote an article on the Chabad menorah recently that just came out, and I went through the whole history of
the menorah. You're still busy with that. You're still busy with the menorah.
I can never get away from the menorah.
Okay, so you mentioned the high priest. So interestingly, the high priest, so, he's their main figure. Is he like the only quote-unquote paisik? Like he's the only rabbi? Or they have other minor rabbis who can give a psak?
Well, they're a little
their own
community.
halakha. Yeah.
It's a small community. And so there are elders, right? If you were to watch our documentary, which is called The Samaritans of Biblical People, the pathos of one of the Sofrim, who at that point when we made the film was the only Sofer. He's since trained, I think our film helped. He's trained a whole group of young people who realized that he was the only Sofer.
Now, I did want to ask you about that, though, because I saw in the book that you wrote that, you talked about that they died out, the descendants of Aaron, so now the Kahanim, or not really Kahanim, they're really Levian, according to them. But what's interesting also says that the Sifrei Torah that they have, and we'll talk about that now, were only written before 1624, and they patched them together. They don't use any that are written after that because the descendant of Aaron. What's the deal with it?
Because there's no Aaronite priest. That means there's no Efer Paraduma. That means that when they do shchita, it's chulin, no matter what they do, right? They're not doing it b'tahara, and they're not going to make the cloth for a Sefer Torah if they're not in tahara. They'd rather use paper, right, than to make it than to make. And so today it's written on paper. Their Sefer Torah, before you ask, is never read. It's used as a symbol. It's always open to Birkat Kohanim. They'll wave it in the Beit Knesset. They'll wave it on the pilgrimages to Mount Gerizim as a way of giving blessing to the community. But they do. It's their equivalent of Vizot. They pick it up and they show it around. Now, what they do read is a codex. They read books written by hand. And that's what they study from, and that's what when they sit in the Beit Knesset and they read the Torah, that's what they're actually reading from. What else would you like to know about that?
Well, let's talk about, you mentioned that they have a Torah, so I'm assuming they just have the 5 books, and they don't have the rest of Nach.
Well, if you ask them, there is nothing beyond the 5 books.
Exactly. So now what...
You hear how I turned the table around it, right?
I hear that.
There are 5 books that were given to Moses at Sinai. Everything else the Jews made up. I just point that out. They have their own book of Joshua, but it's a late midrash. It's not like our book of Joshua in any way. They have a book that's named after Joshua. Their Torah scroll, in most ways, their Torah scroll content is the same as ours. Anybody who's a sofer knows that there are little places today, even when there are differences between different akilot with Sifrei Torah, an aleph here, a hey there, the way you structure Shirat Hayam, all sorts of stuff, right? So they also, in the time of Beit Sheni in the Beit HaMikdash, there were 3 Sifrei Torah. They were called the Sifrei Azara. And the Sifrei Azara, the Beit HaMikdash, were how they decided which reading to use. The Samaritan Torah follows one of those traditions that we know about from the 3 kinds of Sifrei Torah that existed in Beit Sheni. One that now agrees with the Greek translation, one that agrees with our translation, the Masoretic text, and the third that belongs to the Samaritan. But there are a couple of distinctions. Number one, every place it says Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, a place where God will choose, their Torah scroll says the place that God chose. Number one. That's the major change, because it happens all over the place, all the way through Devarim, right? Next, when they do the 10 Commandments, 10 Commandments are a funny thing, because those Dibrot can be organized in different ways. Like Christians had their 10, we have our 10. Everybody has 10, but they're different. But it's slightly different. You do, Anochi as a Dibor. Do you not use it as a Dibor? Every group has its own way of counting 10 Commandments. Samaritan number 10 is you must sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. That's the essential difference. There's a book called Masechet Kutim, which comes from the time of the Gaonim. And in most ways, if you read through it, Samaritans are about like Jews. You can eat their matzah, maybe. And there's things that you can do. You can use them for Milah. And in the 2nd century, they were having these serious conversations. Right? Rabbi Eliezer doesn't like it. Rabbi Akiva does. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel does it differently. Right? Everybody, right? There's all these conversations in the world of the Tanaim, at least theoretically. But as it says at the end, lo mekablim otam ad shekofrim ba har Gerizim. Right? We do not accept them until they give up on Mount Gerizim. And that's where the line is. No matter how similar, they are the other side of the uncanny valley. They're like us. They're similar to us. They have a lot in common with us. They think a lot like us. But for God's sakes, wrong mountain.
What about the Avisha scroll, if I'm pronouncing it right?
Yeah, I'll tell you. The Abisha Scroll. As I mentioned, I made a documentary through my center with this wonderful filmmaker, my dear friend now, Moshe Alafi. And we did it all the way through COVID, which made me miserable because I was here and he was there. But all the way through, I kept saying, Moshe, get them to show you the Abisha Scroll. Get them to show you the Abisha Scroll. And I kept hearing back, they won't show it to me. They won't show it to me. They won't show it to me. So one day I get a call on my iPad. Steve, they're letting me see the Abisha Scroll. Mani tzarich lerot sham. What am I supposed to see there? And so I'm sitting giving him lessons on the Abisha Scroll by Zoom. And what did I tell him? For the Samaritans, this is a Torah scroll that was written by Abisha, I forget his exact place. I think he's the grandson of Aharon, outside the tabernacle. For them, it's their Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, and that's it. Okay? And so when they point at that scroll, they believe that one comes from the moment when when life was good, when the world was full of blessings, when the tabernacle stood on Har Gerizim, and Abisha sat outside the Mishkan writing this Sefer Torah. That's what they believe. Okay? And it's been fixed, and it's a mix, then it's been glued together, and they've rewritten the Birkat Kohanim a bunch of times. They keep gluing it on, and now it's in a glass case, and it has a wonderful, wonderful container made of brass from the 18th century that has a map of the tabernacle on it, and it's wonderful. It's a medieval manuscript. We who are not Samaritans can tell you that that it is a medieval manuscript. Now, if any group understands what it means, how to react when someone tells you that their book isn't as old as they say it is, it's us, right? We have a number of books that academics will say are old, are new, and the Masorah is that they're old, right? And we're frightfully protective. Well, they're frightfully protective of Abisha, and it is their Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai attachment. When it went flying in the Middle Ages on Mount Gerizim on a windy day and got ripped up, they considered it an awful omen as they put it back together again.
How old is it, actually?
It's medieval. 13th, 14th century. I forget exactly, but something like that. And you can tell by looking at the parchment, by looking at the letters. There's lots of ways to tell. But, just as in dealing with our Christian neighbors, there are things that I wouldn't say, right, about how we believe and in ways that we might say in an internal conversation, and they would say in their internal conversation about us. Everybody has their internal conversations. With Samaritans, I am very cautious, which is why I will never call a Samaritan a kuti, and I will never tell them that the Abisha Scroll isn't old.
What about their daily and their weekly practices? You mentioned before, Bet Knesset, they have a shul, They have
two, maybe three now, the one they don't go to, in Cholon. And there's one or two, I think there's now two on Mount Gerizim. There's the central one and there's another one. And they go very early. On Shabbat, they spend a lot of time there. They go very, very early, like 4 a.m. And the Ikar is reading the Chumash and saying Piyutim. No, there is no Shemona Esrei. Yes, they make a fuss over the Shema, okay? And at home, it used to be that the women stayed home and made hummus and cookies, right? What's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is that as the Israeli Samaritans have Israelicized and the Mount Gerizim Samaritans have brought in these women from the Ukraine, all the women are asking with their higher level of education, who. And so there's a lot of shiurim that go on Shabbat morning and family Torah reading and all sorts of stuff. Samaritans have their bar mitzvahs the day that they can recite the whole Torah by heart. It's called a chitma, chatimat Torah. They don't wait till 13. It has to do with skill level.
What about the Mishkan for them? The sacrificial compound / temple. Like, how do you call it? I know you talked in the book. It depends. They have viewed one way. Outsiders view it another way. What's it called? What goes on there?
All right. On the 3 holidays, they go up and they go to a number of stations at Mount Gerizim. They go to the place of the Akedah, and that's where the altar is. Then they go to the wall, to the stones from Yehoshua, which are up there too. Everything's on Mount Gerizim. And they go to the place of Noah's Ark. It's up there too. And they go to a flat place that they call the room, something, I forget. Something Hashemayim, the eternal place. I forget exactly the language and I don't want to blow it. And they do hakafot, essentially, around this place on each of the 3 pilgrimage festivals with the Sifrei Torah. Okay? That's the extent to which they do liturgy on Mount Gerizim. But it's really cool to watch. And you can see it online. and I have some great photographs. Here's the problem. The archaeologists have found the temple that was destroyed by John Hyrcanus II in 127 BCE. Okay? We got it. It's there. Whether you think it's the 4th century or whether you think it's the 6th century, and there's now some debate, it was there for a long time. Okay? And it was there until the Maccabees destroyed it for the purpose of Yom Grizim, which we don't celebrate, except sometimes in my class, if I'm teaching ancient history, I'll bring cookies that day. So, Samaritan tradition, however, is that they never had a temple. That the only building that ever mattered was the Mishkan, which was hidden, which, by the way, it's being hidden is also mentioned in the books of Maccabees, so we knew about it too. So they have this hidden Mishkan that comes back when the Tahab comes, when their Messiah comes, and become very upset, their spokesman, when we tell them they have a temple. I've watched it, because that's not the Masorah, right? And so I've found a workaround. I looked at my contacts and I said, okay, Ein lechem mikdash, nachon? You don't have a mikdash, right? You have an area for korbanot. They said, yeah, we have an area for korbanot. I said, great. Is that building over there the Mechtam Korbanot? Yes, that's the Mechtam Korbanot. In other words, it's all about language. They're happy to have a place that's been established and built beautifully to do korbanot, just don't call it a temple. And that's the balancing act of working with people. It's been very important, by the way, for the YU community, this whole project. You'll very seldom find a YU community rabbi or Rosh Hashiva or any of it talking disparagingly about Kutim anymore, because everybody's cognizant that this is an issue. And there's a real curiosity, because again, it's the next neighborhood over. And so within the world that I live in, our project has had a really nice effect on how people actually think about the other. It's easier to talk about Samaritans than it is to talk about a lot of other people. After all, it's hard to talk, especially these days, about our Islamic brothers, right? It's easy to deal with an ancient people that we have a relationship with that could fit on two. And it's easy to be nice to them, right? And for my students, that's been an important learning experience to think about other people in a safe way. And that's been a really important part of the project. A lot of YU kids were involved in every phase, whether it was our exhibition or our book or our movie. I managed to get a whole bunch of our best and brightest on both campuses involved in things that they never thought they'd be involved in. I remember I was teaching all of the Gemaras and all of the Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Midrashim about Samaritans. The kids were fascinated. And you can really watch the relationship as it develops and where it takes bad turns. And it's really neat.
It's cool stuff. It's definitely interesting,
cool
unique.
Especially when you can walk up and talk to people.
Yeah,
which you're going to do, I hear.
Yes. So that's the plan. I'll report back to you. So let's talk about the Korban Pesach, because that's something that I think people know about. You're making a face at me. Go on. Talk about the Korban Pesach. Tell everyone here listening what happens and why it's such a big deal to them and to outsiders.
Look, the Korban Pesach is what Samaritans have done forever, right? They go on top of the mountain. They do all those things the Torah describes. They barbecue their lamb. They take it out. They take a piece of matzah. They have matzah, sort of like Syrian matzah, this soft stuff. They take real bitter herbs that they pick. They take the meat and they eat it. Just what it's described. They barbecued it in these huge pits. As they're barbecuing it, they're saying all sorts of psukim and piyutim and poems, right? And it's a religious experience par excellence. Now, in the 19th century when they did it, they had to be protected by Turkish soldiers so that they didn't get hurt. Then they had to be protected by British soldiers from the Turkish soldiers. Then, after 1967, everybody and his uncle went to see it in the following year after the 67 war. And now they have bleachers. And so it's Balagan, right? So all of Klal Yisrael goes up on a pilgrimage to Mount Gerizim to watch the Samaritans do the Korban Pesach. For them, it is the high point of the year. It is there. You know how exciting it can be if we do our Seder right, to eat the matzah, multiply that a few times. This is their thing. This is their moment, right? It's
very cool in the book. By the way, we didn't really mention the book. We'll talk about the book at the end, but I'll mention there'll be a link in the show notes you can check out the book. It's like this glossy coffee table book with color pictures throughout. Even though it was published with Brill, which is usually like $400, it's only like on Amazon like $68. It wasn't like
that's because we financed it.
Yeah, so it's got color pictures throughout. You really could see a lot of these things, which is really cool. There's two other things I want to get to. First, about sukkahs, because you have some really interesting pictures of their sukkah. You want to explain a little bit about the sukkah and sukkahs?
Look, when you read Nehemiah and you see what they did on that Sukkot that they said they hadn't done for thousands since the time of Yoshua ben Nun, they went out and collected all sorts of wood and fruit, and they built their booths, right? That's what it says there. Samaritans do that. In other words, historically, they would collect wood and they would hang fruit from the ceilings, and that's how their sukkah would be for the week. But remember, they lived in the Kasbah in Shechem, not a happy place to be an Israelite. And so they couldn't put their sukkot outside. They made the same decision that our Yemenite relatives did in Teiman. They moved the sukkah inside, except in Teiman, they put a hole in the ceiling, which, by the way, they still do in Israel. And in Shechem, they were too poor to do that. They were so poor, and they couldn't put holes in the ceiling. And so they just put their Sukkot in the living room and figured they did the best they could. And so Samaritan Sukkot, now the Masorah is that you put your Sukkah inside. There are a few people who are beginning to put them outside because they sort of like what we do. But a Samaritan Sukkah is a very interesting thing because it's made up of Atzei Pri Hadar. In other words, any beautiful tree, any beautiful fruit. They don't associate the festival of Sukkot with the lulav and the etrog, which is another weird thing. In other words, it looks much more like Ezra and Nehemiah where it's not mentioned, right? Well, for them, it's not only not mentioned, but it isn't. And that's the Samaritan Sukkah. By the way, they decorate it. You can see in the book, they're really pretty. They take all the different fruits and make patterns. One year, one of the families made it in the shape of Mickey Mouse. Last year, somebody else made it in the shape of a hostage ribbon, which I think was really very meaningful because their kids were fighting in Gaza too. I just point that out.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it's really cool to see some of those decorations with the fruit.
By the way, everybody can go visit. If you were in Israel when it's Samaritan Sukkot, which is usually different than ours, okay? Because our calendar intercalates, adds the extra month at a different cycle than theirs, okay? So sometimes our holidays are a month and a half apart. That's really good. Because how else could you go to...
You mentioned anyone who learns Rosh Hashanah knows that. So the calendar is different.
Yeah, so if you go up on Mount Gerizim for Pesach, it's not a problem most years. Every so often they coincide, right? Or for Sukkot, the Samaritan families in both communities open their doors to invite people in for Sukkot. So if you go up to Mount Gerizim on Sukkot, someone's going to let you in his living room.
You can check it out in his house.
Really cool.
I realized we did not discuss the Samaritan dress. How do they dress?
Like everybody else, except on Shabbat where they wear these long kaftans. They look sort of like Yerushalmi Hasidim because of it's the same clothes, right? These in that wonderful golden fabric and a fez, those round red hats. I have my own. I was measured by the tailor, right? He asked me if I wanted golden fabric or if I wanted silver fabric. I take it out once a year on the first night of Pesach.
And you wear it by the Seder?
For the Seder, of course, with my red hat, right? It's my shtick. If I'm not doing a Roman Seder that year, I'll do this.
Sometimes I do a Roman Seder?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, no.
What's an afikomen? It's a Greek word, right? And so I have my Roman cookbooks.
Greek is not Roman.
Huh?
Greek is not Roman.
In the East, in the second century, in the world of Rabbi Akiva, it is.
All right, anyways, go ahead.
So remember that Rabbi Akiva sort of tolerated Samaritans, and his whole generation did as well. There were questions about whether you could eat their matzah, if you can use them as a moel. The relationships were ad kadei kach close. As things began to get better for Jews and as Samaritans also got stronger, the relationships got more tense. And so Rabbi Abahu, following the lead of Rabbi Yochanan in Tveria and then in Caesarea, built up the fences very strongly between Samaritans and Jews. The Bavli, and this is the guys that they're Gentiles, halacha. They aren't to Israeli civil law. And that's the relationship, right? It's a complex thing. If you've ever seen someone named Sophie Sadaka on Israeli television, she is a fallen Samaritan. In other words, she's a Samaritan who left the community. So if you're in Israel and you say Samaritans, somebody's going to say Sophie Sadaka, right? Because she used to be on the children's programs in the morning. And she's very nice, but she's not today part of the community.
So there are a number of other things discussed in the book. There's an article about, we mentioned the Ramban, but discussing Ben Binyamin or Benjamin of Tudela, and he his, talking about the Samaritans and other travelers during the medieval time who saw them. There's 24 articles together with numerous pictures, color pictures throughout. It's about 250 pages, I think, but there's a lot of things here. Like I said, it's an edited volume that you edited, many different things about going from all the way back until modern times about the Samaritans, and you also directed a documentary. So I want to mention that the book I'll link in the show notes. Is the documentary available for those interested in watching it? Is there a way to access that?
Not yet. It's still making the rounds in the theaters and the festivals. But Alafi, the filmmaker, tells me it's coming.
But there's a link. I can include a link to like a preview, like a trailer, right?
Yeah, sure.
So I'll add that link for those interested. Can check out the
for
trailer.
Example, next Friday, meaning tomorrow. Actually, I have to keep this evergreen. Occasionally, Alafi shows it at one of the Israeli theaters. It was actually being shown during Sukkot at the Tel Aviv Cinematheque, and we know how that went. The showings that happened after October 8th didn't happen, of course, but it's being shown. It was shown in Haifa recently. It's in Jerusalem often, and so it's easy to get. And it was on Israeli television. It was on Hot a number of times, and they repeated around Pesach time.
Right. So this is just a snippet of the Samaritans. About an hour long here. There's much more to discuss, and for those interested, can check it out. You can go visit, you mentioned before, right? We plan on going with the Israeli Bornstein Lakewood Efyomi Yarchei Kala to go visit there to Har Grizim. So we'll check it out. I'll report back and let you.
Isn't it amazing that the Lakewood Yarchei Kala is going to visit our friends on Mount Grizim? I think it's just amazingly cool. 2,000 years we had an unpleasant relationship with these other Israelites. And isn't it astonishing that in our world, the Yarchei Kala from Lakewood is going to Har Grizim?
And we'll have a shear up there. Israeli will give a shear, and we'll have a,
Oh, you should go see the archaeological site. You can go see the place, the Rumo Shel Olam. That's where the tabernacle is. You can go see the place where Akedat Yitzchak supposedly happened. There's a wonderful film that you can see on Mount Grizim, and then walk around the community. And hopefully people are out. Mostly it'll be little kids going to school and mothers with carriages, normal people.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Fine, for joining me on the podcast once again.
It's been so much fun. Thank you so much.